what I'm going to do now is move into a brief discussion of a very complex subject in philosophy to set the stage for this discussion that we're going to have about objectivity. I want to talk a bit today about epistemology. Don't be intimidated by the term. Okay? Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that concerns itself with the search for a theory of knowledge. It comes from the Greek, knowledge and theory. Very simple. Epistemology. You'll hear this term, right? Both in sort of formal philosophical debates, but sometimes even in general conversation. We want to think about epistemology generally, and we are at some point going to want to think about the epistemology of journalism. Right? What's the theory of knowledge behind the way journalists work? And you might say to yourself, well, I don't have a theory of knowledge. I just go out and try and figure things out, right? But we all have there's always a theory behind the way we approach these things. And if you stop and think about it, it's a fascinating set of questions to ponder about knowledge. How do we know what we know? We make knowledge claims all the time. Everybody does. On a daily basis, you are constantly claiming to know things. How do you know them? Right? That's what epistemology tries to get at. The underlying principles that guide our claims to know things. Now, epistemology is a very dangerous thing to study because the more you study it, really, the less you realize you truly know. And it can make for a very destabilizing life to constantly question yourself, but we're going to do it anyway because it's important. So today what we're going to do is very quickly go through some basic concepts in epistemology, again, to set the stage for a discussion about the practices that journalists use to try and know things. Journalism, like any other profession, has a set of practices, a set of rules, formal and informal, written and unwritten, that guide the way journalists work. Right? And we're going to examine those, but first we're going to look at some of these background questions. Let's start with what we mean by the term knowledge. As I said, I'm summarizing a complex set of questions. If you took a philosophy class in epistemology, you'd spend a whole semester wrestling with these things. We're going to run through them very quickly. Over email, I'll send you some links if you want to read more deeply, if you get intrigued by this. But let's start with just some of the basics. Traditionally in philosophy, knowledge has been defined as justified true belief. There's a lot of debate about this within philosophy. Philosophers, of course, debate everything. What's the point of being a philosopher if you don't argue about everything? That's what they do. But for some time now, there's been an assertion that knowledge, what we mean when we say we know something, is that we have justified true belief. Okay? So let's just take those three words. Think about what we mean by them. We all have beliefs, yes? I mean, everybody has belief in something. Right? But we all know that people often have beliefs that are a little wacky, yes? You've met people who have beliefs that don't quite make sense to you. Right? So a belief itself is not knowledge. To believe something is not to know it. Right? That we believe things often with, incomplete knowledge. Right? We believe. To be human is to believe, and some things we believe we can't really claim that we know. Right? The most obvious is things that we take on faith, not just religious faith, but faith in general. Right? We believe certain things on faith without really claiming that we know them. Right? But to get through life, you often have to believe without knowledge. But knowledge is not just any belief. It's a special kind of belief. It's justified true belief. Right? So you're believing in something that you know to be true. And you are justified in that belief that it is true. Justified true belief. You know it to be true and you have a good reason for knowing it's true. Right? You don't just claim it came to you in a dream. There's some basis for this belief. Some basis for your claim that it is true. So when we talk about knowledge, we're talking about a very specific kind of belief, a very specific kind of claim. Again, philosophers will argue and have argued and continue to argue about whether this is a definition of knowledge, but it gets us going for purposes of what we need to do in this class. So we want to know the truth. We want to know things. In other words, we don't just want to believe, we want to know what is true. So in philosophy, they talk about approaches to truth or theories of truth. And again, you might say to yourself, oh, come on, if it's true or it's not true. Right? I'm in this room right now. That's true. It's true. It's obviously true. Forget about it. Don't make it more complicated than it is. But in fact, it is complicated whether you want to deal with these kind of questions or not. So better to try and organize your thinking. And in philosophy, there have been in general 3 ways people approach the concept of truth. 3 theories of truth. Now, obviously I'm simplifying. I'm taking a complex field in philosophy and rendering it into a list of 3. So obviously there's much more detail and debate about these questions. But for purposes of organizing our thinking as we go forward and try to understand how journalists operate, we're going to talk about 3 different approaches to truth: correspondence, coherence, and consensus, or what is sometimes called pragmatism. I'll get to that in a minute. Correspondence approaches to truth. What does that mean? Again, nothing fancy about this. A correspondence approach to truth says that something is true when the claim that you make corresponds to reality. When I say that this table is made of wood, that statement is true if, in fact, the material used in the construction of this table is, in fact, wood. The category of materials we define as wood. Right? So correspondence approaches to truth say that we can be secure in our truth claims, our claims to have knowledge, to have justified true belief, when there's a correspondence between the claim we make and the reality in the world that is independent of us and our perceptions. So correspondence theories of truth map most clearly onto what we would call science, yes? Science tries to make claims that explain the way the world works, that can argue successfully these claims correspond to reality, are a good description of reality. Now, you might at first glance say, well, that's the beginning and end of the story. That's what truth means. Knowledge claims mean that what we're asserting is what is real in the world. But again, when you start to think about this, you realize it gets complicated. There's another approach that says, really, truth is about coherence. That it's a complex world, far more complex than any of us can understand. And so what's most important about truth claims we make is not that they correspond directly to reality. Usually, or often, we don't even know how to go that way. It's really about coherence. It's about our truth claims fitting together in some sort of coherent arrangement. Right? And if you think about this, just like the correspondence approach has some obvious resonance with our daily experience, so does this. Because often you have competing truth claims. One coheres with other things you believe, the other one doesn't. Which one are you likely to believe? You have two competing claims to truth. One fits in with your existing way of understanding the world, one doesn't. You're more likely to choose the one that fits in with your existing truth claim. Right? So if you look back to one of the great examples in science, when the majority of folks believed that the Earth was the center of the solar system, right? Claims that didn't cohere with that idea of Earth being at the center tended to fall away. Right? That's why Galileo was such a controversial figure. Right? He was suggesting an entirely new way of seeing things. And once that shift happened, then all those claims that seemed to make sense with the idea that the Earth was the center of the solar system, even the center of the universe, fell away. So coherence approaches to truth also resonate with us because we do see that we don't believe individual truth claims, this one, that one, separately. The way our minds work, the way human beings work, is we believe them as part of a system. All right? Another approach to truth I'm calling consensus, although you'll also see this referred to as a pragmatic theory of truth. I chose consensus because I like alliteration. Basically, I love lists of three that are alliterative. So consensus theories of truth really are approaches to truth that say, in the end, what we decide is true is what works. What we together collectively decide that works for us as a group. This is a theory of truth most clearly identified with the school of thought in philosophy called American pragmatism. And again, we could spend a whole course, we could spend a whole life on pragmatism. But here, pragmatism doesn't mean just, the common sense term of pragmatism. It's a whole school of thought. And it focuses on truth claims that work for us in the world, that we can use to solve problems. The great social philosopher John Dewey, in the early 20th century, one of the important figures in pragmatism, said things are true if they help us solve problems. If you make a truth claim and it helps people come together, form a consensus, and solve problems, then it's true. It doesn't matter whether it corresponds to something in the real world. It doesn't matter if it coheres with other. Something is true when it works. Something is true when we as a social unit reach a consensus about it. So you can see how each one of these approaches to truth resonates with our daily experience. And you can see how each one of them presents a challenge to the others. But these are the ways philosophers talk about truth. Hang with me, because I think it'll become increasingly clear why this is relevant to us thinking about journalism. But before we get to that, keep that list of three in mind: correspondence, coherence, consensus. And let's go back to something I said earlier in the semester about levels of inquiry. I said that when we go about trying to understand the world, we look at basically three different levels: the empirical, the analytic, the analytical, and the normative. We ask and answer questions that are empirical in nature about what we might call the facts of the world. We want to know about the world in a very empirical way. We want to know facts. We want to know things about what happens in the world, and we collect data about that. We also want to know how things work. We've made the point over and over that just knowing facts doesn't help you really move through the world, because to move through the world you have to understand how things work. You have to put those facts together analytically so we understand these things. And so we're constantly not only collecting facts, we're processing all that to try and understand how the world works. And finally, we want to understand how the world works not simply for amusement. It's often very enjoyable to learn how the world works. But in the end, we want to know these things because we have to make judgments. We have to set norms. We have to make political and moral judgments. We have to make normative claims as well. So let's keep these three levels of inquiry. We're trying to understand the facts of the world. We're trying to understand how the world works. And we're trying to make judgments about how the world should work, to set norms. Well, you can see that if you go back to those approaches to truth, they kind of map on to those levels of inquiry. That when we talk about the facts, when we talk about empirical inquiry, we're talking most about correspondence, about being able to claim that the facts that we're identifying correspond to the reality of the world. When we're talking about analysis, we're really talking about bringing all of those facts together in a way that coheres, that makes sense, that helps us analyze how things work. And when we're talking about the normative, we're talking about reaching a consensus, about coming together and using our empirical and analytical knowledge to come to some judgment about how the world should be. So these three approaches to truth, complexity that I'm simplifying, are all in some ways relevant to us. I'm not asking you to choose which theory of truth you're going to align yourself with, because in some sense all three of these, it seems to me, are always operating. We're always trying to establish a correspondence between the facts that we assert and the real world. We're always trying to come up with a coherent analysis that helps us understand how the world works. And we're always looking for consensus about norms so that we can live in a reasonably decent social environment. Right? So all of these things are going to play into how we approach these things. Okay? So think about theories, approaches to truth, think about those levels of inquiry, and then we're going to come back later to apply these to journalism. But if this is still seeming a little abstract, let me give you an example. Okay? It's an example I've alluded to before, but I think it's a really useful one. Let's say we're trying to understand the truth. Right? That's our goal here. We want to understand the truth of a particular moment in history. So I'm going to suggest we apply these ideas to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. It's on my mind because we just passed the anniversary of it this past weekend. Okay? March 2003, the United States launched an invasion of Iraq. I don't think that that's, a question. We all probably remember that, even if we were younger, as you were. Okay? Now, we want to ask a question. The question is, was the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 lawful? Was it legal? Did it conform to international and domestic law? It's an important question. When any nation state goes to war, it's important to ask a question: does the act of war conform with both international and domestic law? So we want to ask a question: was the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 lawful? We want to know the truth of that, correct? You want to know the truth? Does that seem like a question about which the truth is important? You can nod, yeah. I mean, again, lots of different opinions in the room about the nature of U.S. military involvement in the Middle East, that particular military engagement. But it seems that the question is relevant, and wanting to know the truth about that question is important. So what is the truth? We have a question on the table. Was the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 lawful? Did it conform with both international and domestic law? That's a question that is not, academic, not abstract. It's very real and relevant, and we want to know the truth of it. Okay? So how do we determine the truth of that? Well, first of all, we need to know something about the facts, yes? We have to engage in some sort of empirical inquiry. Now, the fact that the United States launched that invasion in 2003 really is not controversial. Right? U.S. troops were deployed, U.S. air power was used. Right? If you're old enough to remember it, it's quite a momentous day. Let's shift not from the facts of the actual invasion, which are fairly well established, to facts about the law. What does the law say? If you're going to ask and answer the question, was the U.S. invasion of Iraq lawful, you have to know something about what the law is that is relevant. And the relevant U.S. or the relevant international law, in fact, we can examine. It comes from the UN Charter. Excuse me. Let me go to that. The United Nations Charter. The UN Charter is the document that structures international law today. It was 1945, the post-World War II era, the attempt to create a new approach to international law. Okay. The UN Charter, which the U.S. is not only a signatory to, but the U.S. essentially drafted. Right. The UN Charter looks the way it does for the most part because of folks in the United States who were central in the drafting of it. All right. So the UN Charter is the controlling document in international law that sets the conditions under which one nation state can engage in military action against another lawfully. The UN Charter is the foundational document. So if we're going to ask, is the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 lawful, we have to go to the foundational document that sets this out. Now, this is long and complex. You have to take my word for it. You can investigate more on your own later. But the UN Charter does set this framework, and it makes it very clear. There are two conditions under which one nation state can engage in military action against another. There are two and only two conditions. The first is when the UN Security Council votes to authorize the use of military force. The UN Security Council, a group of 15 nations, 5 permanent members. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are, anybody want to guess? I'll give you a hint. One of them is United States, Russia, previously the Soviet Union, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia, China, France, and Great Britain. Okay, 5 permanent members. There are 10 other members that are elected in rotation. 5 permanent members, 10 members. The 5 permanent members are important because they have a veto. Any one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council can veto a resolution. Right. This has been in the news lately because there was recently a UN Security Council resolution to authorize the use of force against which country? Libya. Right. All right. So there are 2 conditions under which a nation state can engage in military action against another. One is when there is a resolution of the UN Security Council authorizing that military action. Right. The question then would be asked, was there such a resolution in place when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003? Does anybody know the answer to that? Was there a resolution? No, there was no resolution. The U.S. requested a resolution. The UN Security Council declined to pass such a resolution. So there was no UN Security Council resolution in place when the United States invaded Iraq in March of 2003. The other condition under which a nation state can engage in military action against another state is handled in Article 51 of Chapter 7. If you go down, you can see it. I'll send you this link too. What Article 51 says, listen, you only go to war when there's a UN Security Council resolution that authorizes it, but that doesn't mean you can't act in self-defense. So if the Canadians were about to pour over the border and invade the United States, there was an imminent threat from Canada, right? The United States would not have to wait for a UN Security Council resolution to defend itself. So the exception to the rule that military action must require a UN Security Council resolution, the exception is the right to self-defense. And there's nothing in the UN Charter which undermines the right to self-defense. But those are the 2 and only 2 conditions under which one nation state can commence military action against another. Okay? We've established that there was no UN Security Council resolution. The question then would be, was Iraq about to threaten the U.S. militarily? Was there an imminent threat that gave the U.S. the right to respond in self-defense? That would be the question. And I think the answer to that one, from my point of view, is fairly clear. The answer is no. There were a lot of discussions about weapons that Iraq may or may not have. There were lots of discussions about connections to other groups that might want to attack the U.S. that Iraq may or may not have. Now, it turned out that Iraq didn't have those weapons. It turned out that Iraq didn't have those connections to other groups. But even with those assertions that there might be such things, it doesn't appear that any of that rose to the level of an imminent threat covered in Article 51. So, for the sake of argument, you may not agree with this, but stay with me. The 2 conditions required for a state to go to war with another state, either a UN Security Council resolution or an imminent threat that could engage the right to self-defense, neither one was present. The United States invaded Iraq without a Security Council resolution and without a credible claim to be defending itself in the context of Article 51. So if there are 2 conditions under which the U.S. could go to war lawfully, and neither of those conditions was met, what would one conclude? that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was unlawful. Now, that's the international law. The domestic law that might be relevant comes from Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, which makes it clear that treaties signed by the U.S. acquire the status of what the Constitution calls the supreme law of the land. That when the United States signs a treaty, it is bound to that treaty through its own constitutional provision. So what the U.S. Constitution says is once we sign a treaty as a nation, that treaty becomes law. It has the same force of law as domestic law and the Constitution itself. So the United States is a signatory to the UN Charter. It is therefore by constitutional principle bound to the conditions of that charter. In a sense, you could say that the UN Charter becomes part of domestic law. So we have a clear constitutional provision that binds us to international law in this case, and an international legal regime that suggests that the U.S. had no authorization or justification for the invasion. Okay. That would suggest that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was unlawful, or, in other words, illegal, or, in another word, using the language of international law, it was what is called a crime against peace. A crime against peace is the international legal term for an act of aggression, the commencing of a war. Okay? Now, that's a pretty bold statement on my part, yes? This is not something one hears in the news or discussed in politics. People may agree or disagree about the Iraq War, about whether we should stay, whether we should leave, all sorts of agreements, disagreements. But this is a very different kind of claim. This says the invasion itself was unlawful and illegal. There are implications to that statement, yes? Because if something is unlawful, that means the people who engaged in that conduct broke the law. And when people break the law, there are usually consequences, or at least there's supposed to be consequences, yes? So again, the claim I'm making here is not abstract. It's very important. Now, what I've just tried to do is walk through a kind of correspondence approach to truth. Right? What do the documents that govern this particular question say? We can read them. Right? We want to make a claim that corresponds to reality. Now, I've just made a claim that you can agree or disagree with, and you realize that most people in the culture don't agree with. But it's a claim that we might want to reckon with. But it's not enough to simply say, well, we can evaluate it by this sort of correspondence approach. Either it's true or it's not true. Because if that were the case, one would think there would be a lot more discussion of this in the country, yes? Because we live by the rule of law. The United States is a nation of laws, not men, to use the old gendered approach. Yes? You hear this all the time. One of the things that's distinctive about a democratic state, distinctive about the United States, is we are a nation of laws. We respect the law and legal principles. We're a nation of laws, not men. So you start to see how there's some problems here, because if, in fact, we see ourselves as respecting the rule of law, yet the United States commenced a military action that does not conform to the law, that doesn't cohere very well, does it? Right? That doesn't fit. If we see ourselves as a nation that perhaps more than any other nation on earth respects the rule of law, is rooted in the rule of law, that individuals, people in power, cannot act arbitrarily in violation of the law, the claim that the people at the peak of American power engaged in unlawful activity, that doesn't cohere. It also doesn't cohere with our sense of ourselves as a nation and how we use military power, because we routinely claim that U.S. military power is used for the good of others, which implies it's used lawfully. And so you can see where there's a correspondence question. What do the documents that control these questions actually say? What happened in the world? How do we understand that? But there's also a coherence question. Any conclusion we reach has got to fit with our sense of the world. And you can start to see that maybe the correspondence, even if it's a claim you can make in a compelling way, if it doesn't cohere with the way we think about ourselves in other ways, is it true? And in the end, you can ask, well, it's true if there's a consensus about it. And there clearly is not a consensus that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was unlawful. So it's an example on how all three of these approaches to truth can enter into a very simple question. The question is very simple. Was the U.S. invasion of Iraq lawful? Right? You can ask that about any nation-state's use of military force. When France, primarily France, Britain, and the U.S. launched its attack on Libya, you could ask the question, was it lawful? We're not asking whether it was a smart thing to do, whether it's the moral thing to do. We're just asking, is it lawful? And in that case, the answer is quite clear. At least the initial wave of that military force is lawful. Now, whether it will continue to be depends on how you interpret the resolution and all that sort of thing. But we ask this question all the time. We haven't asked it much about the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And why is that? If we were only interested in a correspondence approach to truth, we would just want to know the facts and then we can reach a judgment. But there's also this coherence, this way that that conclusion has to fit into other approaches that we take to ourselves and our state. And in the end, whether something is true or not may well be a product of whether there is a consensus. So the example, I think, is useful in thinking about these three different approaches. The question about whether or not Iraq posed an imminent threat that would invoke Article 51, in the end, isn't a kind of yes or no question like whether that table is made of wood. And so one way we would test out is by analogy, is the logic that might go into claiming Iraq as an imminent threat, would we use that same logic in other places? So if I saw, he's got kind of a bulge in his front pocket. I think it might be a gun. It has the shape of a gun over here. I think he's an imminent threat. So I'm going to shoot him in the head. All right, would we? Well, you could say, well, it actually looked like a gun. So yes, all of those things would come into play. Right? The point I was making is that there actually was never a claim by anybody who supported the war that Iraq was an imminent threat according to the language of Article 51. There were claims about weapons and claims about what one might call long-term threats. The claims that the administration and its supporters made were not really claims about imminence. They were claims about a long term, which doesn't meet, by any interpretation, doesn't meet the language of Article 51. So even by the claims of the people supporting that interpretation, or supporting the invasion, it really isn't about imminence or not. There could be cases where imminence is a judgment call in the way you're talking about because there's evidence that leads you to believe something is imminent. There could be conflicting evidence that there isn't. In this case, it wasn't even part of the claim. So I use this example because it's edgy, yes? This is not an example, from some other place or some other time. It's an example from right here and now, which has incredible implications. And I think the reason for using examples like this is because it makes these questions about truth real. Truth claims are not simply debated within academic seminars. They have real-world implications. So if we say that we believe in truth in a correspondence sense, that we're always looking for our truth claims to correspond to the reality of the world, then we have to be serious about that and apply that not simply in a seminar, but in the world. We can see how those attempts to create a claim that corresponds to the world also have to fit into some larger system. They have to cohere together. And we can see the conflicts that come. And we can see that in the end, truth is not simply a question about who has the better facts or who has the better system in which to put those facts. It's also a social question. It's about who you can get to believe your truth claim. So I could have a truth claim that's very compelling, but nobody agrees with me. Is it true? Let's say, for purposes of discussion, the truth claim I just made, and it's a claim I believe the U.S. invasion of Iraq was unlawful. I'm not just offering you an argument. I'm offering you an argument I would make. Right? If I can't get anybody to agree with me, is it true? Right? If I have this truth claim that I think is a compelling argument, it corresponds to reality, it coheres in a way that I think makes sense, but I can't get anybody to agree with me, is it true? Interesting question. Right? So what I'm trying to do today is, in a sense, destabilize the common sense way we think about truth. We tend to think about truth as things are true or they're not. And you can prove them or you don't prove them. And everything is very straightforward. We tend to think at this basic correspondence level. But what I'm arguing is we can't stop there. Right? We have to go further and talk about truth in more complex ways. So on